First, let's ask what is the proper federal role in counterterrorism, not just in aviation security, but generally. Well, to begin with, I think we have to, especially in these tight fiscal realities we face today, look at drawing the proper lines where we spend federal dollars. So to begin with, fundamentally, is it a public good? And if it is a public good, we should spend public dollars. But if it's a private good, it should be left to the private sector. And commercial passenger aviation is a private good. So in general principle, if we can keep that in the hands of the private sector, we'd be allocating resources more effectively. Also, fiscal federalism is very important. I talk about this in the policy analysis with regard to wasteful federal grant programs where we spend federal dollars to either subsidize or incentivize state spending. We also give out a lot of many millions of dollars in wasteful grants to localities for a lot of unused decontamination equipment. You've probably heard a lot of these stories. Finally, we have to scrutinize the cost effectiveness of whatever dollars we spend. And of the money that we've spent since 9/11 in Homeland Security, a lot of it's been wasted. In fact, a recent study by Professors John Mueller and Mark Stewart found that in order to survive a cost-benefit analysis, increased Homeland Security expenditures since 9/11 would have to deter, prevent, foil, or protect against 1,667 otherwise successful Times Square-type car bombs per year, or more than 4 a day. Now, there simply aren't that many terrorists out there, and we've done a good job since 9/11 of shedding our liberties and a lot of dollars in the futile pursuit of perfect safety. Perfect safety is not attainable. And so moving towards the case for privatization, I think we have to admit the fact that a lot of what we do in aviation security is security theater. It is efforts to make us feel safer, but they might not actually make us safer. And I would include in this removing shoes, liquid quantity restrictions, body scanners, generally security theater. And as a noted security expert Bruce Schneier puts it, we'd be better off returning our security to a pre-9/11 regime on the passenger side and focus on airport employee screening because they have access that we don't, baggage screening for explosives, and relying on investigation and intelligence work to intercept terrorist plots because that's a more effective use of resources, pays bigger dividends on the dollar. However, there is no bureaucratic incentive to reach this conclusion and to enact these policies. Quite the opposite. In fact, bureaucratic incentives dictate essentially fighting the last war and not letting an attack repeat itself. Sort of DMV logic, right? And because of this, wait times, efficiency, inconvenience to the passengers, ultimate effectiveness are secondary concerns to covering the reputation of the bureaucracy and the people in charge of it. There's also a general trend to creep away from a free society. I think it was striking how within a 2-week period, the NFL screening at stadiums, because one person snuck a taser into a football game, went from just regular metal detector, magnetometer screening to enhanced pat-downs in a matter of 2 weeks. I mean, it's just an amazing knee-jerk response that we're sort of programming ourselves into. And I think the only way we're ever going to get to a rational employment of aviation security resources is if we take government out of it, because the market will simply do a better job of allocating risk and resources to address the risk than the government will. So have we seen some privatization? Well, we have in a form, and this is the Screening Partnership Program. As you probably know, it was created by ATSA, the authorizing legislation that created the TSA. It started as a pilot program with 5 airports to ascertain whether or not it was feasible to do airport security after 9/11 the way that we had always done airport security, letting airports and airlines provide the security. After that initial 5 airport test was deemed a success, it expanded to 16 airports. However, that 16 airport count has been capped as the TSA has moved toward unionization and a collective bargaining agreement. From this, we've seen that private security, or at least contract security, is no less effective than the TSA. federalized screeners, and no one on the side of federalizing is pointing toward a lack of effectiveness. And in fact, in many of the studies, we found that they're more effective than the federalized screeners. And there's a bit of a war of numbers here, but generally speaking, I think we can say that it will not cost more than employing federalized TSA screeners if we were to have the Screening Partnership Program screeners. A quick rundown, there's a lot of data going back and forth, but the initial bearing point study found that contract screeners performed consistent or better than TSA screeners, and screening costs were marginally reduced in most cases. And the report also noted that had the airport security directors had the ability to really use all of the tools of a privatized system, they would have been more efficient. TSA has countered that the Screening Partnership Program, the contract screeners, would be as much as 17% more expensive. The GAO has questioned the techniques. It cut it down to 3% more expensive, but the TSA has failed to enact all of the data, the number crunching reforms. So there's this war of numbers about how much it'll cost. But I would note that the recent House Committee on Transportation Oversight found that privatizing LAX, the Los Angeles International Airport alone, would save $38 million annually for the taxpayers. And then in some cases, the contract model can be 65% cheaper than TSA employees. But let's note that the Screening Partnership Program is not privatization. It is an instance where the TSA gives permission to the airport to move towards a contract model. They select the contractor who will provide the security. They dictate the methods by which security is provided. That's not privatization. And if we were to actually move to a fully privatized model, all of these costs would be off of the back of the taxpayer and on the flying public, because the cost of providing security would be paid for by the costs within the airline ticket that you would buy, and not as it is now, about 25% is paid by a TSA fee, $2.50 added on to each ticket, and the rest is picked up by the taxpayer. But if you were to pass all of it on to the flying public and not the taxpayer, then you would see a significant reduction in costs, wiping out almost all of the federal costs for providing aviation security. Now, there's two routes to do this. First, just outright abolish the TSA and allow for the insurance market to provide the fallback if there is a terrorist attack. And let's admit that terrorists have a great airlines have a great incentive to prevent terrorist attacks. Going bankrupt is a great incentive not to allow terrorists on your planes. And if there is some squeamishness about allowing the free market to do the work and to allocate risks effectively, the Safety Act can provide some limited liability for certified security providers. So if the airlines and airports were to get certified, then there would be some cap on liability. But I think that the pure market incentives, don't let your planes get blown up so you don't go bankrupt, is a pretty good model. So as we move towards unionization, a few words about that. First, this will be a much more rigid labor model than the one that we currently have. And I think that even though the initial collective bargaining agreement, as agreed upon in the initial letter put out by Director Pistol at the start of the unionization process, even though it puts some of the full-time labor provisions off the table and says we're only going to allow collective bargaining over the part-time labor provisions, that's actually a really significant piece of the puzzle, because right now TSA maintains what is called the National Deployment Force, and this is a pool of TSA screeners that deploy to offset seasonal demand and other labor shortages at the non-SPP, the federalized airports, at a significant additional cost to the taxpayer. Now, why is it significant? Because you're picking up a federal employee, you're flying them to some other place, you're paying for a hotel room, you're paying per diem, and you're displacing them from their family. So instead of doing that, I think it's obvious that letting the market take care of this and letting those airports who have a seasonal flux use a contractor, use part-time contracts to fill that need, I think that's a much more effective and a better economic model for that piece of the security market for aviation security. And I would also note that collective bargaining has not worked out well. In other contexts, the Border Patrol has been stung several times with the Federal Labor Relations Authority, dictating by terms of collective bargaining disciplinary issues within the Border Patrol, someone falling asleep at their post. Is that something we can discipline over? Do we have to have a warning letter first? Training issues. So transporting that into the TSA is actually going to decrease our security and actually increase our labor costs. So it's just a lose-lose for the taxpayer. So I'm going to move on now to the Federal Air Marshal Service and how I think abolishing the Federal Air Marshal Service is important because it makes a significant emotional leap to get past the events of September 11, 2001. I say this because it was a hijacking, and we make the emotional connection between a hijacking and an air marshal by saying, man, if we had just had air marshals on those flights, that wouldn't have happened. I think that as we go through the facts, we'll see that we have sufficient counter-hijacking resources in place. We do not need the air marshals, and admitting that reality and realizing that this is an area where we are strong would undermine some of the inflated terrorist threat that is bandied about in the media quite frequently. So a bit of history about the Air Marshal Service. First, there are a few dozen. I think the number is actually 33 prior to September 11, 2001. And it grew to over 1,000. The number is classified right now, as it should be. As Representative Duncan from Tennessee has noted, we spent $860 million for an average of it's actually 4.2, but 4 arrests a year. So that's $215 million average spent per arrest. That number is now $930 million, so the math is actually worse. But I think we have to discuss what's our metric, what's our yardstick for success with regard to the air marshals? Is it arrests or is it deterrence? And should we view them not so much as law enforcement officers, because by the time they're making an arrest, a lot of systems prior to the air marshal intervening have broken down, or is it to deter hijacking attempts? And if the rationale is to deter hijacking attempts, then you don't really need a law enforcement officer, you just need a security guard. And if we envision the air marshals as plainclothes security guards, it makes a lot more sense than using federal law enforcement to do that. So, as I said, there's a lot of time and distance from September 11, 2001, and terrorists have changed tactics. And the tactics employed on that day are not the tactics we see today. We don't see attempts to get into the cockpit by groups of men armed with melee weapons. We see people trying to secret explosives onto the plane. And because of this change in tactics, even the airlines are now questioning the utility of maintaining air marshals as they have been employed since 9/11. And they've actually recently asked the Federal Air Marshal Service to please take your officers out of first class because you're using our prime real estate, our most lucrative real estate in the plane, and the threat simply isn't there, necessitating putting your officers in between the bulk of the body of passengers and the cockpit. Well, if the airlines have made that leap, then why can't we? So we should also note that it's really not a very effective, in terms of cost effectiveness, getting back to making rational decisions about spending money. It's not a very good deal for the taxpayers. So what are the odds of an air marshal stopping a hijacking attempt? Well, right after 9/11, some proposed an Israeli-style 100% coverage, put an air marshal on every flight. That's actually pretty much prohibitively expensive. And we would spend more than we spend on the whole of the TSA, about $8 billion right now. We would spend actually $9.3 billion to reach 100% coverage. So right now what we have is 10% coverage. And one study which assumed air marshal presence on 10% of all flights still found that the cost per life saved was $180 million. Now that is far more than the Office of Management and Budget recommendation of $1 million to $10 million. $180 million is a pretty extreme amount of money to spend on per life saved basis. However, hardened cockpit doors, which we installed right after 9/11 on all airliners, are exceedingly cost effective, with an estimated $800,000 per life saved. So that's a very good expenditure of resources. And I think we should note, just to segue here into what's changed, There are two big changes since 9/11 and actually on 9/11 that changed the rationale of hijacking. The first, of course, is the aforementioned hardened cockpit doors. Very cost-effective, very good counterterrorism measure to employ. The second is that the passengers know that they have to fight back. We're playing for all the marbles now. We are not going to get hijacked, flown to some remote tarmac, and negotiate for the release of political prisoners. The airliners are now a cruise missile. They're weaponized, and they want to crash them into high-value terrorism targets. So 3/4 of the way through on Flight 93, the passengers fought back, and the unorganized militia took down Flight 93. And since that time, we've seen in unruly passenger incidents, we have about 200 a year. The passengers react. They subdue fellow passengers who try to conduct a terrorist attack. We saw this with both the shoe bomber and the underwear bomber, both tackled by flight attendants and fellow passengers. And if you just do a Google search on unruly passenger subdued, you will be astounded at how frequently this happens with not just terrorists, but being intoxicated can get you hogtied by your fellow passengers. But if we are attached to this idea of having armed counter-hijacking personnel on aircraft, the deterrence is actually enhanced if it's privatized. Why is that? Because the entire critique of cost effectiveness with regard to air marshals is only possible because we live in a pretty open society. So because their bottom line budget is a matter of public record, we can look at that and say, that's pretty cost ineffective. Now, if this was employed by the airlines and Delta had a body of air marshals that they employed, like private plainclothes security guards, Southwest had one, and they would periodically show an advertisement advertising the prowess of the air marshals in close quarters firearms marksmanship. That's good deterrence. And when you ask how many they have and how frequently they're employed, they just say, well, that's just part of our overall operating budget. And you don't know. That's deterrence. And you get that from a private model, not a public one. I should also note that in terms of having armed personnel on the aircraft, if you're attached to this idea, then the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program, the means by which we arm pilots, is a great deal for the taxpayer. We spend $25 million a year on the whole of crew training, including the Federal Flight Deck Officer or the Armed Pilot Program, because the pilots volunteer for it and they foot the bill, they travel to the training, they pay for the expenses associated with being qualified for the program. That's a great deal for the taxpayer, and honestly, the skill level required for an armed pilot shooting at someone breaking through the already hardened cockpit door, which is unlikely, but if it happens, you don't really have to be as proficient as an air marshal to get that done. And I would note that we have a body of pilots who are willing to do this. 70% of them have some military background, and so I think that that they can do that job in an extremist situation. So now, while I have a captive audience and I've got you in your chairs, I'm going to talk about my policy analysis for a little bit. So I talked first about how the Department of Homeland Security, as an umbrella organization, doesn't make a lot of sense. On Capitol Hill, we always hear this proposal how we need to have one committee that oversees all DHS operations in each chamber. That is a completely unrealistic goal. There are 108 committees that have oversight over DHS. Why is that? Because when you take 22 previously unconnected federal agencies and you stick them under one management umbrella, that requires a lot of oversight. So this one committee business is completely unrealistic. And can you imagine if we did that, the size of that committee? What would the staff look like? So you would have an unworkable management problem within the staff to supervise the DHS if you were to do that. And honestly, as a management theory, this is called span of control, the number of subordinates that you can have under one supervisor, or in this case, the number of subordinate agencies you have under one supervisory administrative umbrella. If this made sense, then in the free market, there would be one company, right, aggregating everyone's goods and services into one place. If this made sense in terms of government, all of the duties and responsibilities in the cabinet would have been lumped together under one person, the Secretary of Government. It doesn't make sense. We haven't done those things. It's simply an unworkable model. The next part of it is abolishing the TSA. I've talked about that. I also go in depth on waste and federal grant programs, specifically the State Homeland Security Program and the Urban Area Securities Initiative. And then I wind up talking about federal funding for fusion centers, and these are state and local organized intelligence analysis cells that I think spend a lot of money duplicating the efforts of the FBI in counterterrorism and are driven mostly by following the money. In the recent book by Dana Priest and William Arkin, there's a great section on Tennessee and why they have 3 fusion centers. Why do they have 3 fusion centers? Well, they didn't think they needed them, but there was grant money, so let's have 3. So the bottom line is there's actually a much smaller terrorist threat out there than is advertised much of the time. And spending our public dollars, our treasure, is an important task of government, and I think that abolishing both the Transportation Security Administration and the DHS is a good step in the right direction.